Hello and welcome to EdPsych 501, screencast number 1. My name is Ken Kaur. I'm one of the co-instructors for the course. And I will be taking you through 4 topics today: Introduction to Educational Research, Research Approaches, Variables and their Roles, Research Questions and Hypotheses. In particular, topics 3 and 4 will be very important for the activities that we take part in this week. Just a general note on my presentation style. I will be working through the slides and using the cursor to highlight things with the blue highlighter when I feel like it's important. I'd encourage you to take notes and re-watch areas where you would like clarification, but to also bring questions to the weekly sessions, because we will start off every session with a question and answer period so that you can have issues clarified. Another note on my process for presenting: essentially I will be highlighting important material that you've read through and also adding to it. So with that, I'll give this a start. The first thing I wanted to highlight is that educational research is situated within the realm of social science research. And social science research, compared to its counterpart, which there's not really a term for it other than to say hard science research, so things like chemistry and physics. Social science research involves the study of concepts and phenomena that are not as easily measured and as easily agreed upon in terms of what it is you're studying. And in general, I think that results in a real focus and emphasis on rigorous methodology. So you see all of these areas listed here. They would all of the methodology that we're going to cover and introduce you to would be introduced in a similar way, and the domains may necessitate additional language, but for the most part the fundamental methods of quantitative and qualitative research can be applied across these areas. So another bit of context that is important to keep in mind is the study of education and the areas of research within the study of education. And so housed in the U of A faculty of education are 3 major areas: educational policy, educational psychology, and curriculum and pedagogy. So policy is really what it says. It's policy about how we do education at all the different levels. Educational psychology is another big area. It involves things like counseling psychology, school psychology, educational measurement, learning theory, motivation theory. Now, and curriculum and pedagogy is more of the applied area of educational research. So it's understanding how to develop and design curriculum and instructional techniques in order to best educate. And so there's a relationship across all 3 of these areas, but for the most part, these are the main areas of educational research. Now, another way to think of educational research is that you can break it up into different domains. So essentially, we've got early childhood education, so pre-K education, and there's a lot of research being done in this area these days in terms of what predicts success later down the road. And then there's the big area of K-12 education, which is what is mostly studied in the faculty of education, and the faculty of education is designed to produce educators. And then there's the area of higher education. Of particular importance for our course is the idea that in higher education we have non-professional faculties and professional faculties. The non-professional are the sort of generic arts and general science degrees. And then the professional faculties would be things like engineering, law, and now the big area of health sciences. Within the health sciences, there are many disciplines. The authors of the textbook give us 5 different kinds of research, and they talk about research as being able to be characterized in multiple ways. And the first way they talk about are the different kinds of research, and the first one they mention is basic research, and this is what they say is aimed towards developing or generating fundamental knowledge and theoretical understanding, as opposed to applied research, which is focused on answering real-world practical questions and provide solutions to problems that we may be dealing with. Now, an example of basic research might be something like in the study of cognitive psychology, establishing the existence of something called a priming effect. So, is it true that when a person is shown images in short bursts, that they actually become primed to think in certain ways? And the area of psychology is probably most associated with basic research. The idea that you're building theory, you're building an understanding of how human and natural processes work. So an example of applied research might be when you're examining something like whether different ways of providing instructions to test takers. So in an educational context, we're always giving tests. And there's this theory out there that the way we give instructions can actually set people up to perform worse. And the working hypothesis is that when you cue people to certain characteristics they have themselves that are known stereotypes, the idea that you belong to a minority group who typically underperforms, and if you somehow cue a person to that fact before they take a test, they will actually underperform compared to people who weren't cued to that. So that's an actual problem that we have in many educational contexts, that minority groups tend to underperform, and people are trying to understand why that's the case and formulate ways to deal with that problem based on an understanding of what's actually happening. The next kind of research is evaluation research. In a higher education setting, this is very common type of research to have happen. And essentially, it's the type of research where you're trying to assess the effectiveness of different kinds of programs or interventions that we implement in order to impart education. So I think within the context of professional schools especially, where our primary goal is to produce professionals, whether it's educators, physicians, engineers, lawyers, when the primary goal is to produce those types of people, there is always going to be questions about whether or not we are doing that effectively. A couple of terms that you probably read about, but I'll point out again, in the realm of evaluation research, we can talk about formative and summative, and in a lot of ways those terms are not only applicable in evaluation, but formative evaluation would be the idea that while a program is running, we are assessing its effectiveness and feeding that information back so that we can make improvements. So it's less about determining whether or not something had an effect, as opposed to in a real-time situation determining the effect of a program so that it can be improved in an ongoing way. Now, summative is the program's over, it's been implemented, and potentially you want to revise it slightly and redevelop it, but it's already happened, and basically you're going back and checking to see if the outcomes were achieved. So that's an important distinction to know within the realm of evaluation research. Now, action research, on the other hand, is this idea that within a local setting, you have specific problems that you're trying to solve, and so you initiate a very rigorous research approach in order to generate information and evidence to help you make decisions about how to proceed. So in an orientational research framework, there is actually an agenda at play, and the researcher is trying to advance a particular agenda. But when it comes to objectives of research, I think this is a little bit more universal in the sense that people do talk about the objectives of research as being either to explore something, to describe something, to explain something in detail, to determine whether you can predict things based on your understanding of relationships, and then of course to influence. And you can see these map a bit back to the kinds of research we just talked about. So influence would be more orientational, Predict, I think, could fall under any of the other previous categories. Describe and explain, again, these are things that can be within a basic research world or in some of the other, evaluation and action research type descriptions. So the next idea to touch on, and that's important to understand within the world of educational research, is that we are in the world of science. And so there are implicit assumptions at play. The first being that the world out there can be studied. And part of this world is unique, and part of it is patterned and regular and predictable. A lot of the world is changing and complex, but ultimately it's discoverable, and that it's possible to document and to describe the regularities in how we all experience the world. Another assumption is that there are agreed upon norms and practices that are involved in using a scientific approach. So some of these include things like the way we collect empirical data. We must be willing to openly discuss our findings, and that we must conduct research with integrity, honesty, and competence. We must employ systematic processes of inquiry. We must maintain neutrality and respect towards our participants. Whenever you're employing a scientific process, we must acknowledge that curiosity is at play and that openness to discovery is important. We must always be skeptical towards the results and explanations that we come up with. And we must be actively searching for evidence that does not necessarily fit the current or emerging explanations. So this idea that we're constantly trying to disprove what we know. We must be willing to examine and explore alternative explanations for our findings. And we must adhere to a principle of evidence. It is possible, the fifth assumption associated with the scientific approach is that it's possible to distinguish between more or less plausible claims, between good and poor research. So based on the idea that we have agreed upon norms and practices, and we can judge the quality of research in terms of how well it was done. So ultimately, though, science cannot provide answers to all questions. Types of scientific methods. There's the confirmatory type of approach. This is more traditional in the sense that you are testing hypotheses. You're working through a process of logically justifying your expectation. So the steps involved are to state a hypothesis based on theory, test the hypothesis empirically by collecting data, and then based on your analysis, tentatively accept or reject the hypothesis. And this is in contrast to an exploratory approach, which is more about generating hypotheses. So it follows the logic of discovery and making observations, studying the observations to search for patterns, and then making a tentative conclusion about how some aspect of the world works. And we call that making a generalization. So theory building. What is a theory? In fact, this is probably one of the most important concepts of the course. Theory is very important for developing research questions, for identifying hypotheses. Theory is an explanatory system that describes how phenomena operate and why it operates the way it does. I think this is a concept that really becomes more understandable as you dig into some of this. And so when we read some of the examples later on with actual variables and concepts and phenomena discussed, I think this will become more clear. But essentially, your theory is the explanatory system. Okay, so that basically covers the introduction to educational research, where it's situated, some of the assumptions about how we approach scientific inquiry within educational research. And now we're going to shift over to just introducing you to the general approaches to research. So the first approach is the quantitative area of research, and another way of describing this is variable-oriented research. The second approach is qualitative research, which is case or phenomena-oriented research. And then, of course, there's mixed research, which is a combination of the two. And the way we think of mixed is you describe it based on how you combine the two types of research. Do you start with quantitative and then identify areas for qualitative inquiry? Or do you start with qualitative in order to be able to define a basic theory that informs your hypothesis that you test quantitatively? And so we'll talk a little bit about that idea. So what are some of the differences between quantitative and qualitative research? And these are just generalities, so it's dangerous to talk in generalities, but for the most part, and as an introduction to the concepts, this is a good overview. The purpose of quantitative research is typically to study relationships between variables. We design our methods prior to conducting the research. We employ deductive approach where we're testing theories and hypotheses. We use standardized measures as our tools, and large sample sizes are required more so than small sample sizes. And all of the analysis is very quantitative in nature, statistical in nature, and subject to all of the assumptions of statistical testing. On the other hand, qualitative, the purpose is typically to try and understand phenomena. Design can evolve during the study. It's a very much inductive approach where we're trying to generate theory as opposed to test theory. Tools are very much focused on face-to-face interaction with small sample sizes. And analysis is done on narrative descriptions where we're trying to produce interpretations of large amounts of text-based data. There are two types of quantitative research. One is non-experimental, the other is experimental. The primary difference, or the only difference between them, is that in experimental research, we use random assignment to create what we call equivalent groups. So by randomly assigning people to groups who will then be subject to our study, we guarantee that we start out with groups that are equivalent on all variables that could be measured. And by starting out with equivalent groups, we can then attribute any change in outcomes that we measure to the presence or absence of the intervention or the treatment. If the groups were non-equivalent at the beginning of the experiment, then any difference that we see in outcomes that are measured at the end of the experiment could potentially be attributed to something that we didn't control, some pre-existing difference in the groups. And so in the category of non-experimental research, you are always subject to the third variable problem. Essentially, there could be an alternative explanation for any effects that you observe. So that's the key difference between these two types. Random assignment allows you to make inferences about causality. Non-experimental research doesn't. You will always be speaking about relationships in non-experimental research, and you can talk about effects, actual causal effects in experimental research. So what are the kinds of non-experimental research? Descriptive is basically you have a sample, you measure a host of variables, and you simply characterize the sample on those variables. Then you move up to correlational research, where you actually are starting to talk about relationships. And in correlational research, you have a sample who you measure multiple variables on, and you start to assess the strength of the relationship between the variables. Causal comparative is ex post facto research. So after the fact, after people have been naturally assigned to groups. So you're naturally assigned to being a male, you're naturally assigned to being a female. You look for differences in those groups on some measured variables. Now, quasi-experimental research is where you don't have the ability to randomly assign, but you still are able to introduce an intervention, and you still are able to have a control group. So you can start to study whether or not introduction of a intervention or treatment results in an effect, you'll be subject to the third variable problem, and we'll have to speak about limitations and try to control for obvious variables that you would want to control for. And so it's a useful technique, and it's actually very useful in educational contexts because we don't always have the ability to randomly assign, and that doesn't mean you can't do good research to assess the relationships between variables. It's very useful, and you can often still make strong claims about causality within a non-randomly assigned experiment if you implement procedures of control. And so we'll talk about some of those later on in the course. These are the 4 categories of research that look at relationships. So correlational, in no way, shape, or form are we trying to assess causality. We're just basically describing relationships. So we're in this cell right here. So we're not searching for cause and effect. We're just describing relationships. In causal comparative, you potentially are trying to assess cause and effect because if you implement enough control for enough of the third variables that I was speaking about earlier, you can build a pretty strong case for cause and effect. Similarly with quasi-experimental, if you implement enough control over the experiment without actually implementing random assignment, you can start to make claims about cause and effect. And of course, in experimental research, your sole purpose is to make claims about cause and effect. Manipulation. Where does manipulation occur? Obviously not in correlational. All we've done is measured things. Similarly, in causal comparative, all we've done is measured things. We've taken note of your membership into a group or your non-membership, and then we've measured some other variable, and we're going to look at differences in that variable based on your group membership. Quasi-experimental. This is where we start to manipulate. We introduce some intervention, some program, and again, I'll highlight the fact that this is the realm of most educational research when it comes to experiments, when it comes to assessing on the fly effectiveness of programs. So by implementing strong quasi-experimental designs, we can start to assess causality, but it does involve manipulation. And then, of course, in experimental research, you are manipulating the presence of an intervention or not. This row is almost not necessary. I've said it so many times, but the only place where we employ random assignment is in experiments. Creating variation in the effect variable. Well, you'll see that this row is very much the same as the second row. That highlighting is not working. But the answers to the question, does it create variation in the effect variable, are the same because you have to manipulate something in order to get an effect on the variable. Now, tries to explain pre-existing variation in an effect variable. Pre-existing, that's your key here to how you answer this across the question. So correlational, it's pre-existing because there was no manipulation. So this row is essentially the opposite of the manipulation row and the creating variation in the effect variable. And then finally, your possibility of drawing causal conclusions. You can't do it in correlational research. It's relatively weak in causal comparative research. It still can be very weak in quasi-experimental, but with implementation of control, you can get closer and closer to a strong argument for causality. So this concept of causality is something that you should read more about, and it's very important in educational research because we don't have much control over interventions and intervening and random assignment. And when you can't randomly assign, this is the world that we operate in. Okay, types of qualitative research. Remember, qualitative research is about trying to describe and understand phenomena. So we begin by talking about phenomenology. Phenomenology is the study of individual's experience of a phenomenon. So you're trying to characterize a small, not even sample, but one or two or three, at most 5 or 6 people's experience of a phenomenon. Ethnography, on the other hand, is when you are placing yourself within a culture, within a group of people who have established a culture, and you're trying to describe and understand that culture and explain that culture based on observing people naturally in their context. Case study research is all about developing a detailed description of examples or cases of different types of phenomena. So you've got one example that will resonate with education in the context of health sciences is in my home faculty of pharmacy, there has been a move to integrate informatics, online informatics module into the curriculum, and it's being done across the country. So each school of pharmacy across the country is producing case studies of their experience of integrating this resource into their curriculum. And so each case serves as a detailed description of how that process played out. Grounded theory is area of qualitative research where you're trying to generate a theory based on emerging understanding. Now, historical research is sort of an area of analysis where the primary data source are artifacts from history, so whether it's books or videos or newspaper clippings that provide a narrative description of events. And so historical research will go back to those artifacts and again try to understand or describe the experience of history through an interpretation of the artifacts that have been collected.